On July 2, 1970, a family touring the Great Ocean Road in Victoria, Australia, noticed tire tracks leading off a cliff at Loch Ard Gorge near Port Campbell. Below was a car, mangled and destroyed. At first, it seemed like the car was stolen and dumped, but then they noticed something strange. A pipe was extending from the exhaust and into the driver's side window. Inside were the bodies of members of the Crawford family: 34-year-old Teresa and 3 children, 12-year-old Catherine, 8-year-old James, and 6-year-old Karen. Hearing that might sound like a family just got into an accident, but the state of their bodies pointed towards something else. They were found wrapped in blankets, bludgeoned, and burnt. This was no accident. Someone did this to them, someone close to them, and they've been on the run ever since. The Crawford family lived in the small suburban town of Glenroy, situated to the north of Melbourne, Australia. Elmer Crawford, the family's 39-year-old patriarch, had emigrated from Ireland in the 1950s and was a quiet, hard-working handyman from Quebec, Canada. For 14 years, he'd been working at Victoria Racing Club. He spent most of his time maintaining the household and taking on various local jobs, living a monotonous but fulfilling life. His wife, Teresa, was a stay-at-home mother who cared for their 3 children and managed a family of 4, mostly by herself. She was also pregnant at the time, expecting their 4th child. The family seemed like a model suburban household, warm, loving, nothing like the families who were already starting to feel the effects of the world changing. But it turns out that might have just been a front for the world. No one knew the darkness that would eventually destroy it from the inside out, until their car was found, crushed, 200 miles from where they lived. On that July 2nd morning, a group of tourists were scanning the cliffside through binoculars when they spotted the car around 25 meters below on a rocky ledge. It was an older model Fay Holden with its bonnet crushed, debris scattered all around, and the driver's side door wide open. The tourists initially thought that the car had been stolen and dumped, but when they noticed a thick black hose running from the exhaust pipe over the roof and into the driver's side window, they noticed something wasn't right here. When they went in to take a closer look, a drainage ditch near the cliff's edge had prevented it from being pushed over. It seemed like someone had spent 2 hours building a makeshift bridge of rocks to roll the car across the ditch and over the cliff. The intention seemed clear: to make the car plunge into the blowhole and disappear forever. But despite that, it was found. The tourists rushed to Port Campbell to report the incident, bringing a local police officer back with them to the scene. They could see the car's interior smeared with salt spray and wondered whether the driver had somehow fallen into the sea and gotten swept away. The police officer on the scene had 2 possible explanations. Either the car had been pushed over the cliff with no one inside, or it had been driven deliberately, perhaps involving a suicide. The setup of the car, especially the hose running into the cabin and jammed windows, pointed to one thing: this was not an accident. A rescue team from the Port Campbell Rescue Squad was called in to retrieve the car, as the sunset would soon limit visibility and the possibility of a successful rescue operation. George, a trained rescue worker, went down the cliff and noticed how accurately balanced the vehicle was, with 1/3 of its width hung over the edge. The front of the car was heavily crushed from a hard landing, then bounced back into an upright position. The hose immediately stood out for them, and with that, they also noticed that there was a rope tied to the steering wheel, leading somewhere toward the back of the car. Inside, there were numerous items: electrical tools, a toolbox, and some strange materials, including a plastic slip-on shoe and .22 caliber bullets. But there was more. The back seat was removed, and the space was filled with odd objects: tarp, sheets, a car battery, and several large containers of petrol. The car was essentially a potential explosive hazard. Just one spark from the battery could have set off a dangerous explosion. This made George wary of continuing his investigation too aggressively, but pushed him to look closer at other items. Upon further inspection, He noticed what appeared to be blood on a coat and the seat. One of the most concerning discoveries was a .22 caliber rifle with its barrel pressed down against the car's clutch pedal. When George opened the rifle's breech, he found a live round inside. Back at the police station in Port Campbell, a detailed inspection of the items retrieved from the car was carried out. There were family photos, old bank books, a packet of biscuits, and an odd homemade weapon, a kosh, a lead pole encased in rubber. A 10-meter extension cord with several lengths of electrical cable, each featuring a small alligator clip and a normal household 3-pin plug. Items that a regular family would just carry with them on a trip. These were deliberately put in the car. The car's license plate number was traced, and records revealed it belonged to 41-year-old Elma Crawford, whose address was listed in Glen Roy, a suburb northeast of the area. So that ended up being the first place the detectives needed to go to figure out what happened. On the evening of July 2nd, a police officer was dispatched to Crawford's home after the tragic discovery of his family at the bottom of the cliff. It was a single-story brick house with a caravan parked on the front lawn, a somewhat regular family residence. Upon arriving, the officer knocked on the door but received no response. He then saw that the windows were all dark, but nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary, except for the fact that the house was empty. His suspicion was confirmed when he went to the electrical meter box outside, where the officer discovered a small jar of coins, and it looked like it had likely been there all day. This suggested that no one had been home since the morning. The meter disc was still, meaning no electricity had been used during the day. All this hinted that Crawford had not been at home for several hours. With his whole family missing, this was even more concerning. He should have been spreading the word, looking for them, but he was just gone. The only way this made sense was if he was the one behind it all. But the investigators had no idea what they were in for. From the moment the police started piecing together the clues found in and around the vehicle, it became clear this didn't just happen. The way the car was positioned, and all the disturbing objects that were found at the scene, especially the hoses and the blood, meant that all this was planned. As the investigation moved forward, officers concluded that there was a connection between the crime scene and Crawford's life. It all started to come together. As detectives dug into Crawford's personal life, they found signs that greed might have been the reason behind the murders. Crawford and his wife had changed their will just days before the murders. The new wills said that if something were to happen, Crawford would inherit everything the family had, no questions asked. So, the timing of it all was extremely suspicious. The investigators also came across an unfinished letter Therese wrote to her family about her 4th pregnancy and how she was upset over it. Alongside the letter, police discovered a newspaper article about abortion. The couple didn't really want the 4th child, but she was already too far along. With all the other things that stood out, detectives also found items stolen by Crawford from his previous employer and evidence that he had been selling stolen goods for years. That's how he actually made his money. Being a handyman was just something he did to get his foot through the door. Crawford's financial history showed signs of stress, and witnesses remembered times when he acted erratically, showing anger and resentment toward his wife and kids. With the will changes and growing suspicions about financial motives, the pieces began to fit. It all pointed to him. This was a man who had planned this moment, knowing exactly what it would cost to erase his family, and it wasn't for the faint of heart. Crawford knew what he needed to do had to be done as quietly as possible, so he made an electrocution device using a 15-meter electrical lead fitted with alligator clips, which he would later attach to his victims' bodies to deliver fatal electric shocks. It was going to be quick, easy, and effective, but also brutal. Crawford's first victim was his wife, Therese. He connected the alligator clips to her ears while she was asleep, rigging up the electrocution device to administer a deadly shock. The shock did exactly what he had intended. The electrical lead, alligator clips, and signs of the shock made it clear that her death was intentional. After killing his wife, Crawford turned on his daughters. His youngest, Karen, was bludgeoned to death with a hammer he took from the family car. Karen's murder was quick but brutal, totally the opposite from the cold electrocution of his wife. His attack on her showed how far Crawford had fallen into madness. Next, Crawford targeted his older children, Catherine and James. He used the same electrified device on them, just as he had with their mother. By the time he killed his children, Crawford had become completely desensitized to the horror he was committing. Forensic reports revealed that he executed the murders without any sign of panic. He planned every step of the killings, showing a complete lack of emotion. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. After Crawford killed his wife and 3 children, he took careful steps to hide the evidence and mislead the police. The first step was to get the bodies as far away from the house as possible. So, he wrapped them all in blankets, put them in the car, and drove 120 miles away to Port Campbell. That way, the car wouldn't immediately get him in trouble. To cover his tracks, he attached a hose to the exhaust pipe, shoved it through the driver's side window, and made it look like Mrs. Crawford had killed her children before taking her own life. As he pushed the car off the cliff, Crawford didn't see the rocky ledge just 16 meters below, where the car ended up resting. Believing he'd done what he came to do, he made his way back home. How exactly he got back to Glenroy isn't clear, but it's possible he hitched a ride or used a small scooter he had hidden in the trunk with the bodies. Police think he killed his family and tried to get rid of the bodies sometime between sunset on July 1st and the early hours of July 2nd. Sightseers first spotted the car hovering on the edge of the blowhole at 1:30 p.m. on July 2nd. Crawford was seen in his driveway at 5:50 p.m. that day. Officer John McCarty was sent to his home at 6:20 p.m. after a check revealed the car belonged to Crawford. The car hadn't been searched yet because it was dangerous and needed special equipment. The evidence suggests Crawford was inside the house cleaning blood when Officer McCarty knocked. There was a bottle of cleaner, bubbling up, left in the middle of the house. The officer got no answer, so since it was just a routine visit, he left and went back to the station. It's believed this is when Crawford gave up on his plan to make it look like his wife and kids had left him and decided to run away himself. Later that night, at 10 p.m., Officer McCarty returned to the house after hearing there was a rifle in the car and blood on the seats. This time, he and another officer forced their way inside. They found blood-stained sheets and mattresses. The homicide squad was called in, and plans were made to search the car the next morning. Cliff Rescue volunteers George Cumming and Cecil Bergen were lowered down to secure the car and prevent it from falling into the sea. As they started searching, this was when they found the bodies wrapped in bed sheets. Detective Adrian Dunhue, who would later become head of the Major Crime Squad, was at the top of the cliff that day. He was the first to realize just how brutal the crime was, a crime that would haunt Victoria's police for generations. Crawford used the electrocution device on his family, making the deaths seem like an accident or even a failed suicide. The unusual method of death would confuse the investigation, especially since the bodies weren't found right away. The electrical tools in the car could easily be mistaken for personal belongings, further misleading authorities. After hiding the bodies, he left the house looking normal so the wellness check team wouldn't think anything suspicious was going on. But that plan backfired because he had already fled. Once Crawford had hidden the bodies and covered up the evidence, he seemed to disappear completely, almost as if he had been murdered himself. In the days after the crime, investigators realized that Crawford had not only left the house, but had also cut off all ties to the outside world. Authorities tried to locate Crawford by looking into his finances, phone records, and travel history. But Crawford had planned everything. He didn't make any large purchases or withdraw money. His accounts remained inactive, and there were no flight bookings or travel routes that could help the authorities find him. What made the investigation into this case even harder was that Crawford stopped all communication with his family, friends, and acquaintances. No one received letters or phone calls from him. Crawford was trying to erase all evidence that he had ever existed. His ability to avoid being caught by the authorities left his family, the public, and those who knew him wondering how someone could disappear so easily. Some believed that Crawford might have planned his escape in advance, with the murders being the final step in his plan. There were rumors that Crawford may have fled to a new identity or a place where no one knew him. Investigators followed leads in distant cities, rural areas, and even neighboring countries. Alerts were sent out, but no one found any clues to his whereabouts. Former homicide detective Adrian Donahue reported that 3 people saw Crawford walk to his gate and look around, and he thinks this sighting suggests Crawford was inside the house when the officer came in for the wellness check. Despite multiple attempts, the search for Crawford seemed to go cold. There were no physical clues, no belongings, and no notes left behind. The only thing he left behind him was a horrible crime. Donahue believes Crawford's original plan was to report his wife and children as missing. But when he realized the police were already investigating, he decided to run. Donahue imagines Crawford might have gone to an outback mining town to live quietly as a fugitive. Greg Fogarty, who grew up on Cardinal Road, where the Crawfords lived, thinks there are clues to his motive, like the unfinished letter from Teresa to her family and her disappointment about being pregnant again. There were also 2 letters to the editor from a 1969 edition of The Age discussing the abortion debate. Teresa had struggled with severe postnatal depression after their 3rd child. Fogarty believes Teresa may have refused Crawford's demand for an abortion as a Catholic, and they couldn't really handle another child. Crawford had also been stealing from his job for a long time at this point, and Fogarty thinks the threat of being exposed may have driven him to insanity. Crawford had $3,000 in the bank, owned the Glenroy house, and had land in Queensland. He had a lot to lose in a divorce. He thinks if the car had gone into the water, Crawford would have claimed his wife had a breakdown and drove the car off the cliff with the kids. But that part of his plan failed miserably. The only option left was to run. The theory is that if the car had been found, it would have looked like a murder-suicide. Teresa didn't have any major injuries to the bones, so later, if skeletal remains were found, only the children would show signs of physical injury. A girl named Brenda Connor was the last person to speak to Crawford before he disappeared. At 8:15 a.m., on the day of the killings, she walked to the Crawford house to fetch Catherine for their walk to school. Connor remembers that Crawford answered the door, which was strange because he was usually at work at that time. She only saw his face and hand around the door, as he said his daughter isn't going to school today because she's got the flu. Brenda left, not thinking anything of it, but she hasn't been able to forget about it since. In 1994, an acquaintance reportedly spotted him in Western Australia, but they weren't able to track him. In 2008, a reward of $100,000 was offered for information leading to his arrest, but it yielded no results. In July 2010, Victorian police, working with the FBI, used facial recognition technology to try to identify a man who died in 2005 in San Angelo, Texas, believing he might be Crawford. The man had no fingerprints and carried multiple identity documents. Even though this seemed like a major lead, it was a bust. DNA comparison with a Crawford family member ruled out any connection between the man and Crawford. It's been 54 years since the day of the murders, and Crawford has still not been found. Could he still be out there? We would love to know your thoughts in the comment section. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.